Rain slid down the windshield in long, trembling lines, blurring the world outside into shadows and shapes that didn't seem to belong. I pulled up to the end of Bracken Street, where the pavement broke into uneven cobblestones, and there it was, the Addington house. It rose out of the overgrown garden like it had been waiting for me. The trees around it bent inward, their branches heavy and wet, forming a canopy that seemed to shut the place off from the rest of the town. Every window was sealed by thick velvet curtains, a deep crimson that swallowed the light. Not a single flicker showed through. But sat there for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled, feeling the weight of my aunt's last letter in my pocket. Her handwriting had been shaky, the words smeared like she'd been in a hurry. It said only one thing: never look behind the curtains. It made no sense. She'd left me this house, the keys and nothing else. No instructions about her belongings, no explanation for why she'd lived here alone for years. Just that warning. I stepped out into the rain, the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves filling the air. The iron gate gave way with a groan, the sound echoing across the yard. My shoes sank slightly into the mud as I followed the cracked stone path toward the front door. Up close, the house felt even stranger. The paint was peeling and the wood trim warped with age, but there wasn't a single broken pane of glass. No sign of decay inside that I could see. Just those curtains, unmoving, heavy, like they were holding something in. When I slid the key into the lock, it resisted for a second before turning with a sharp click. The door opened slowly, releasing a faint, cold draft that smelled of dust and something faintly metallic. I hesitated on the threshold. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel in winter. It was deeper, the kind that sinks into your bones. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow me as I stepped inside. The rain softened outside, but the silence in here felt louder than the storm had. I closed the door behind me, and somewhere deep in the house, I thought I heard the faintest rustle, not from the wind, from fabric. Curtains shifting. The bell above the diner door gave a little jingle as I stepped inside, the smell of frying bacon and burnt coffee wrapping around me. I slid into a booth by the window, rain still dripping from my coat. A few heads turned in my direction, not out of friendliness, but the way people look at a stranger they've already decided to keep at a distance. I ordered coffee, though it was clear no one came here for the taste. The conversations around me were low, murmured, but the same name kept surfacing, tucked between sentences like a secret too heavy to say out loud. Addington. An older man at the counter leaned toward the waitress, speaking in a voice so low I could barely catch it, something about them being old money, about strange habits. I pretended to stir sugar into my coffee just to listen longer. There were gaps in their words, pauses so long they felt louder than what was said. It was in those silences that I could feel the weight of whatever hung over the Addington name. Another voice joined in, this one from a man in a grease-stained cap. He said no one in town had ever seen an Addington funeral. Not once. People died in that family, everyone knew it, but no church bells rang, no processions wound down the road, no graves were dug that anyone could find. A younger guy at the far table laughed under his breath, though there was no humor in it. He said he'd once been walking past the house when the entire family was supposed to be away on a trip. He swore he saw movement behind one of the upper windows. Not a shadow, not a trick of light, something leaning forward, pulling the curtain back just enough for an eye to look down at him. No one told him he was lying. No one even questioned it. They just went quiet again, and the sound of the rain on the diner roof filled the air. I realized then that whatever lived in the Addington house wasn't just about the people who had been in it, it was about what might still be there, watching. When I left, I could feel the weight of their stares on my back, like they all knew I was walking towards something I shouldn't. And somewhere in me, I wondered if the curtains in that window would be waiting for me tonight. The front door groaned as it opened, the sound echoing through the vast hollow space beyond. The air inside was still heavy with the scent of dust and something faintly floral, like lavender that had rotted in the vase. My footsteps felt too loud against the polished wood floor, as if the house had been holding its breath for a very long time, and I had just disturbed it. The furniture loomed in every corner, massive dark pieces carved with patterns I couldn't quite make sense of, their shapes like twisted vines and strange faces. None of it looked moved in decades. Even the dust seemed reluctant to settle on them, clinging instead to the air. The curtains were the first thing I noticed. They weren't just thick, they were suffocating. Deep velvet so heavy they seemed to drink in the light from the small hallway lamps, leaving the corners of the room in an oppressive shadow. I tried one of the ties on the nearest set, but the knot was stiff, almost glued in place, and I let it be. By nightfall, the house felt larger than it had in daylight. The sound of the rain on the roof was muted by the layers of fabric at every window. I wandered through the hallways for a while, checking doors, each one revealing another room frozen in time. Eventually, I settled into the bedroom my aunt had used, lighting the old lamp on the nightstand and pulling the quilt up to my chin. That seps, when I heard it. A soft, deliberate sound from somewhere down the hall, not the creak of wood or the shifting of the old house. It was the slow, distinct whisper of fabric being drawn aside. A curtain. I froze, straining my ears. It came again, longer this time, as if someone was sliding the heavy cloth over a brass rod. I knew I hadn't been in that room. I had left its door closed. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced by the deep, consuming quiet of the house. My heart pounded in my ears, each beat a little too loud in the stillness. I told myself it was nothing. The wind, maybe, or the house settling. But when I reached for the lamp to turn it off, I could swear the darkness behind the curtain seemed thicker than it had before, and it felt like it was waiting for me to look. It was the only door on the ground floor that didn't open with a gentle push or a stiff turn of the handle. This one was secured by an iron latch, thick and pitted with rust, fastened from the outside, as if whatever was inside needed to be kept there. I tried it twice, rattling the metal in my hand, but it didn't budge. The keyhole was empty. I crouched to look closer, my eye catching on the narrow gap where the wood didn't quite meet the frame. The air seeping through was cooler than the rest of the house, carrying with it a faint, stale smell, something like perfume that had been shut away for too long. Through the slit, I could just make out a sliver of velvet curtain. It was the same deep, suffocating fabric I'd seen in the other rooms, but here it seemed darker somehow, as if it absorbed every scrap of light that dared to reach it. I leaned in a little more, trying to angle my view past the folds, but the fabric hung in perfect stillness. The longer I stayed there, the stranger I felt. It wasn't fear at first, more like a slow pressure building in my chest, the kind you feel when someone is staring at you from behind. My breath grew shallow without me realizing it, and a dull ache formed in my stomach, twisting tighter the more I lingered. It wasn't set right. I knew it in my bones. I straightened up, telling myself to leave it alone, but my hand stayed on the latch. I thought I heard something then, so faint I almost convinced myself it was in my head, a soft, deliberate shift, like fabric being drawn between two fingers. I froze, ear tilted toward the gap, but the sound didn't repeat. When I stepped back, I had the oddest feeling that the strip of velvet I'd seen wasn't just hanging there, it was angled now ever so slightly, as if someone inside had moved it to look back at me. I walked away faster than I meant to, refusing to glance over my shoulder until I reached the far end of the hall. Even then, I could swear the air felt cooler, like whatever was behind that door had followed me part way. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. When I opened my aunt's desk, the drawers were stiff, the wood swollen from years of damp, but the bottom one slid out with a reluctant groan. Inside, beneath a stack of yellowed receipts and brittle envelopes, was a bundle of letters tied neatly with a black ribbon. The ribbon itself was frayed and dusty, but the knot was tight, like it had been tied by careful, deliberate hands. I carried them to the light of the window. The handwriting was elegant but uneasy, each stroke heavy as if the pen had pressed too hard. The first was dated over 100 years ago, signed by Beatrice Addington, Every letter was addressed to someone she called Dearest N. At first, they read like the confessions of a lonely woman in a too large house. But the more I read, the more the words began to twist into something else entirely. She wrote of shadows gathering in the corners of rooms, of feeling them lean closer when the lamps burned low. She spoke of children in the household who were taken by the curtains, swallowed whole, she said, without a sound. I had to read that line twice, my pulse tightening with each word. One letter mentioned the need to feed the silence so it would not grow hungry. She never explained what that meant, but she wrote it like a command, not a metaphor. The letters began to skip days, then weeks, her handwriting growing more frantic, words crammed into the margins, as if she couldn't write fast enough. She stopped using names entirely, replacing them with initials, or simply calling them the others. She described how the curtains in certain rooms began to move on their own, swaying without any draft, their folds deepening as though something inside them shifted. I didn't realize how tightly I was gripping the paper until one of the sheets nearly tore. My hands were damp. Then I reached the last letter. It was shorter than the rest, written in jagged, uneven lines. "The silence is awake now," it began. "It knows I have nothing left to give it." The next sentence trailed off mid-word, the ink smeared as though the pen had been dragged away. There was nothing after that. No signature, no date, just a faint, almost circular mark in the lower corner, as if something damp had touched the paper and lingered there too long. I set the bundle down, but even as I closed the drawer, I could swear the air in the room had thickened, heavier, as though it too was waiting for me to feed it. The hallway felt colder than the rest of the house, the kind of cold that clings to your skin and follows you as you move. The light here was dim, filtered through narrow windows that seemed designed to keep most of the day outside. Lining the walls were portraits, one after another, stretching so far down the corridor, they seemed to disappear into the gloom. Each frame was heavy and gilded, holding stiff, formal faces that stared out with a kind of restrained disapproval. Men in high collars, women with hair pulled so tightly back, it looked painful. No one smiled. They all looked like they'd been told to sit perfectly still and not breathe until the artist allowed them to. I was halfway down the hall when I saw it, the one that didn't belong. The frame was the same as the others, the brushwork just as careful, but the composition was wrong. The year, painted in tiny gold numbers at the bottom, read 1893. The Addington family stood in their usual rigid formation, but instead of facing the viewer, they were all turned slightly to their right, gazing at something just outside the painting's frame. Behind them was a curtain, drawn almost completely closed. Only the faintest sliver of darkness showed between the folds. I don't know why it unsettled me so much. Maybe it was the fact that, unlike the others, this portrait seemed caught mid-moment, as if it had captured something the painter shouldn't have. My eyes kept going back to that tiny gap in the curtain. It was just paint, just pigment, but I felt certain there was something in that darkness, something they were all looking at. I stepped closer. The details sharpened, the way the children's hands clutched each other, the subtle tilt of the matriarch's head, as though she were listening for something. Even the shadows in the folds of the curtain seemed deeper than they should be. That's when I realized my hand was reaching toward the canvas, my fingertips hovering just over the surface. I pulled back quickly, heart thudding. It was ridiculous. There was nothing there. Still, as I walked away, I couldn't shake the thought. That curtain existed somewhere in this house. I was sure of it, and the strangest part was the feeling that it was waiting for me to find it. By the time I reached the end of the hall, I had already made the decision I knew I shouldn't. I was going to look for it. It started as a murmur, soft enough that I thought I was imagining it. I lay there in the dark, eyes open, my breath shallow. The sound came again. Low, overlapping voices, too faint to make out the words, but with a rhythm that felt almost conversational. I sat up, straining to hear. They weren't coming from outside. They were inside the house, somewhere below me. The longer I listened, the more I noticed. There wasn't just one voice. There were several, speaking over each other, rising and falling like waves. Sometimes one would drop to a hush, and another would swell in its place. The strange part was the texture of it, muffled as if the voices were speaking through layers of fabric. I told myself it could be the wind. This was an old house, but there was no draft, no rattle of windows, just that quiet, persistent murmuring. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold under my feet, but my palms were already sweating. I crept to the stairs, each step groaning under my weight. The whispers didn't fade as I moved closer. If anything, they grew clearer, though still impossible to understand. When I reached the bottom, the hall stretched ahead of me in that dim, golden glow from the wall lamps. The curtains, those heavy floor-length things that seemed to drink in the light, hung perfectly still. No movement, no draft. I stood there, frozen, my eyes locked on them. The voices were right there. I could hear them pressing against the air just beyond the folds. That's when I felt it. The air shifted, not cooler like I expected, but warmer, humid, almost damp, like the breath of someone standing far too close. It clung to my skin, seeped into my hair, and made my throat tighten. My instinct was to back away, but my body wouldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the curtains, knowing that if I reached out, the fabric would be warm to the touch, knowing that someone, or something, was on the other side. The voices stopped, not faded, stopped, all at once. The silence was heavier than the whispers had been. I finally took a step back, my heart hammering, and that was when I realized something worse. The curtains hadn't moved, but now they seemed a little closer to where I stood. I told myself I wasn't going to touch it. I had sworn to keep my distance, to pretend the curtains were just fabric and nothing more. But standing there alone in the hallway, the silence pressing in, I gave in. My hand rose before I could stop it. The fabric was warm, not just warm, sunlit warm, like it had been hanging in a summer breeze all day. But there was no sunlight here, not a single window near enough to reach it. The warmth seemed to pulse faintly against my fingertips, almost as if it were alive. I flattened my palm against it, and that's when I noticed how thick it was. Not the ordinary heaviness of old velvet, but a thickness that felt endless, as though it could swallow my whole arm if I kept pushing. My breath caught. I gave the smallest, most cautious tug, expecting the curtain to shift easily, but it didn't move. It resisted me, as if something on the other side had caught hold and wasn't letting go. I tried again, a little harder. Nothing. My mouth went dry. I stepped back half a pace, my heart picking up speed, but curiosity wouldn't let me leave. I reached out one last time, curling my fingers around the edge, feeling that unnatural warmth seep into my skin. The resistance was still there, steady, unyielding. I imagined a hand mirroring mine, gripping the opposite side. The thought was so vivid I could almost feel the pressure of its fingers through the fabric. I let go. The moment my hand dropped, I felt a change. The air thickened, warmer than before, and I realized I was holding my breath. Then it happened. Something shifted just beyond the fabric, subtle but impossible to mistake. A faint shape pressed outward, stretching the curtain toward me. Not a hand, at least, not one shaped like ours, but a blurred outline, smooth and formless, yet undeniably aware of me. It stayed there for only a second before vanishing, retreating back into whatever lay behind. The curtain swayed the slightest bit, as if exhaling. I stepped back until my shoulders hit the wall, my skin prickling. I didn't need to look any closer to know that it had been aware I was there, and worse, it had been waiting. The attic smelled like dust, and something older, something that had been trapped for more than a century. My flashlight cut through the shadows in thin, trembling beams, catching on cobwebs and the curved backs of forgotten furniture. That's when I saw it, a trunk tucked into the far corner, its leather cracked, the brass latch rusted but still holding. It groaned when I opened it, like the air inside had been sealed too long. Inside, the smell hit harder, yellowed paper, aged glue, and a faint metallic tang that made me think of dried blood. I began pulling out stacks of newspapers, each one more brittle than the last. At first, they seemed ordinary. Birth announcements, local advertisements, the mundane history of a small town. But then I found the one from 1872. The headline alone sent a cold ripple down my spine. 3 Addington children declared missing in home, no break-in detected. The article described the disappearance in unsettling detail. The parents asleep upstairs, the doors locked from the inside, no signs of struggle. The only thing anyone reported hearing was a strange rustling sound during the night. I didn't want to keep reading, but my hands wouldn't stop. Another clipping, this one from 1904. It spoke of a sickness that had swept through the Addington family, taking 6 members in a single week. No public burial. The phrase that stood out to me was bodies prepared privately. Prepared for what? Exactly. I kept digging. At the bottom were photographs, faded and stiff. They showed the family in various decades, posed in stiff rows, blank eyes staring at the camera. But in more than one of them, my gaze kept drifting past the people. In the background, almost blending into the shadows, were the curtains. The same heavy, dark curtains that hung in my hallway now. They looked identical, even after all these years. The folds fell the same way, the edges slightly frayed. In one picture from the 1920s, a boy stood just in front of them, and I swore there was the faintest bulge in the fabric behind him, as if something unseen were pressing forward. My fingers trembled as I set the photographs down. The air in the attic felt closer now, heavier, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. From somewhere below, faint and muffled, I thought I heard the sound of fabric shifting. It started with a feeling I couldn't shake, the sense that I was never truly alone in the house. No matter where I stood, it was as if the walls themselves were leaning in, listening. The air felt thick, like the quiet was pressing down on me, waiting for something. The curtains were the worst. Every time I walked past them, they seemed to shift ever so slightly, not from a breeze, but like something on the other side was moving to get a better view. I told myself I was imagining it, that old fabric settles and sways on its own. But then I began to notice it happening, even when I stood perfectly still. In the kitchen, it got worse. So I was pouring water into a kettle when I noticed the teacup on the table. It was resting where I'd left it, until it wasn't. Without a sound, it slid forward just a few inches, smooth as if an invisible hand had pushed it. My breath caught in my throat. The cup didn't topple. It didn't wobble. It just stopped, perfectly upright, like it had been placed there on purpose. I stood frozen, listening. The quiet was so heavy it felt like my ears were ringing. My own heartbeat sounded too loud. "Hello?" My voice cracked more than I wanted it to. Saying something out loud was the only way to break the suffocating silence. My words seemed to fall flat in the air, swallowed by the room before they could echo. After that, I started talking to myself more often, just little things, describing what I was doing, commenting on the weather, anything to fill the stillness. It made me feel slightly less like prey. But sometimes, mid-sentence, I'd hear something shift faintly behind me, like the curtains brushing against themselves. When I turned to look, they'd be perfectly still, their folds heavy and unmoving. The worst was at night. I'd walk through the hallway and catch the faintest sensation of eyes following me. My neck would prickle, my stomach tighten, and no matter how quickly I turned my head, I'd find nothing but shadows and the deep, dark hang of those curtains. Still, I could never shake the thought that something behind them had just stepped back in time to avoid being seen. I heard the knock before I even made it to the front hall. Slow, deliberate, like whoever was on the other side wasn't in a rush to be answered. When I opened the door, Mrs. Kettering was standing there. Her small frame wrapped in a faded shawl, clutching a pie dish like it was an offering. She smiled politely, but her eyes didn't match the expression. They flicked past me into the house, scanning the shadows behind my shoulders. "Thought you might like something sweet," she said, holding the pie out. I thanked her, reaching for it, but she didn't step forward. Her toes stayed planted firmly on the welcome mat, as though an invisible line kept her there. "Would you like to come in?" I asked. It was instinctive, polite. Her grip on the dish tightened, knuckles pale. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "No, dear, I won't set foot in there." I laughed awkwardly, trying to make light of it, but she didn't smile. Instead, she leaned closer, lowering her voice like she was afraid of being overheard. "Don't open the curtains at night," she said. The words hit me harder than they should have. Maybe it was the way she said them, not as advice, but as a command. "Why?" I asked. Her eyes darted to the side, toward the nearest window, where the heavy folds hung motionless. "Because they serve part of the house now," she whispered, "and the house is part of them." I didn't understand, and she didn't explain. She simply placed the pie in my hands, turned, and walked away with surprising speed for someone her age. I stood there for a moment, pie in hand, staring after her as the wind picked up. The front yard seemed quieter than usual. Even the birds weren't singing. When I finally closed the door, the house felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. I glanced at the curtains, the same way Mrs. Kettering had. They didn't move, didn't stir, but it felt like they were aware of me. That night, I kept replaying her words in my mind. Part of the house, part of them, I didn't even know who or what she meant. And still, when the clock struck midnight, I found myself standing in the hall, staring at the curtains, wondering what would happen if I disobeyed her. It was after midnight when I felt it, a faint shift in the air, like the house had taken a slow, deliberate breath. I was walking down the upstairs hall when a curtain near the end swayed, just enough to catch my eye. There were no open windows, no vents, nothing that could have caused it. I froze, watching the fabric ripple, as if something had brushed against it from the other side. Then the draft came again, colder this time, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth. I don't know why I stepped closer. Curiosity, or maybe something else, something pulling at me. My hand hesitated halfway to the fabric, my pulse thudding in my ears. The air was different here, heavier, charged with a strange static that prickled along my skin. The curtain shifted again, just enough to reveal a thin gap. I leaned in, expecting to see plaster or maybe a forgotten window, but there was no wall, just blackness. Not the kind of black you see when a light is off. This was deeper, thicker, like it swallowed the glow from the hallway behind me. It stretched on, farther than it should have, as if the house ended here and something else began. And it wasn't still. The darkness pulsed, slow, steady, almost like a heartbeat. I swear I felt the faint vibration of it through the floorboards. My stomach turned cold. Every instinct told me to back away, but I couldn't stop staring. The more I looked, the more it felt like the darkness was looking back. Something shifted deep inside it, just far enough to make out the suggestion of movement. I stepped back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The curtain fell back into place as if nothing had happened. I didn't open it again. I didn't have to. That night, when I finally managed to sleep, the blackness followed me. In my dream, it wasn't behind the curtain anymore. It was in my bedroom, filling the corners, sliding along the floor like smoke. And it pulsed there too, slow and steady, keeping rhythm with my heartbeat until I realized it wasn't following mine. It was making its own. I didn't know I was dreaming until I saw them. Children. Dozens of them. They stood in perfect rows, their small bodies rigid, their pale faces turned toward me. Their eyes were the worst part, washed out, almost colorless, like someone had drained the life from them long ago. They were behind the curtains. Not just one set, but endless ones stretching into the distance. The fabric hung heavy, thick, and dark, muffling every sound except for their voices, but their mouths never moved. The words came all at once, layered over each other, a whisper that somehow felt louder than a shout. They told me the Addingtons promised them something, that's all they said, over and over. The same phrase, the same strange emphasis, until the words stopped sounding like words at all. The air behind the curtains was cold, sharp enough to sting my lungs when I breathed. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. My gaze darted from face to face, but they all stared straight ahead, as if looking past me at something else. Then, one of the children tilted her head, just slightly. Her eyes found mine, and the others followed, one by one, until the entire row was looking at me. I woke with a jolt, my heart pounding. The room was dark and silent, but my skin was clammy, my nightshirt sticking to me as if I'd been lying in water. The sheets were damp, cool against my legs. That sepse, when I saw it, a thread of deep red velvet lying across my chest, thin but unmistakably soft, catching the faint light from the window. I pinched it between my fingers, and it seemed to hum like it was holding the last echo of a sound I couldn't hear anymore. I sat up, scanning the room, half expecting to see a shadow in the corner. But there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the children were not gone. They hadn't left when I woke up. They were just waiting, silent, behind the curtains, exactly where I'd seen them. And maybe, just maybe, one of them had already stepped out. I knew the parlor door had been locked the night before. I'd checked it myself. But that morning it was open just a crack, as if someone had slipped inside while I slept. The air that drifted out was wrong, heavy, cold enough to sting my skin. It carried a faint, musty scent, like something that had been sealed away for years. I pushed the door wider. The light from the hallway barely touched the inside. Every curtain was drawn tight, blocking out the morning sun. The shadows clung to the corners like they didn't want to be disturbed. I stepped in, my shoes pressing into the thick rug with a muffled sound. My breath came out in thin clouds. Then I saw it. One of the curtains along the far wall wasn't hanging quite right. Its fabric swelled outward in a soft, round bulge, like it was hiding something, or someone. I froze, my eyes locked on that shape. It didn't move, not even a tremor, but the air around it felt alive, like a slow pulse was pushing against me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to close the door, walk away, and never speak of this again. But something else, something deeper, told me it was waiting for me, not moving, not speaking, just waiting. I took a step closer. The rug seemed thicker here, swallowing the sound of my footsteps until all I could hear was my own breathing. I reached a point where I could see the faintest twitch in the curtain's edge, as if it was breathing with me. My hand hovered in the air, inches from pulling it back. My fingertips tingled, almost numb. And then, a faint sound, not a voice, not exactly, more like the distant echo of children laughing, buried deep under the fabric, muffled so much it could have been my imagination. I jerked my hand back. The bulge didn't flatten, it didn't move at all, but the curtain seemed to settle heavier into its folds, like whatever was behind it had just leaned closer. I backed toward the door, never taking my eyes off it. The cold didn't lift until I was in the hallway again. And as I pulled the door shut, I swear I felt the faintest brush of velvet against my fingertips. I didn't mean to read all of her words at once, but once I started, I couldn't stop. Beatrice Addington's handwriting was shaky in the early pages, but as the entries went on, her letters grew jagged, pressed so hard into the paper they nearly tore through. At first she wrote about the house, the way you describe a sick relative, something you loved but feared was rotting from the inside. She spoke of noises in the walls, of curtains that swayed when there was no wind. She called them hungry. I thought it was a metaphor, until I read about what she fed them. It started small. Dead mice she found in the attic, a sparrow that broke its neck against the window. She'd slide them behind the heavy velvet folds and listen. The fabric would twitch. Sometimes she swore it sighed. But over time, small offerings weren't set enough. Her writing changed, sentences cut short, as if she was glancing over her shoulder while scribbling. She mentioned stray cats, disappearing. Once, she wrote about a neighbor Sip's dog that wouldn't be missed. The entry that froze my blood described something worse. She hinted at more willing offerings, though the word willing was underlined twice, as if she didn't quite believe it herself. I kept flipping through the brittle pages, my fingers leaving faint smudges on the yellowed paper. Near the end, her voice became desperate. She wrote about the curtains whispering to her at night. She couldn't see their mouths, if they even had mouths, but she felt their breath against her cheek. They told her they were patient, that they could wait until she was ready. Her second-to-last entry ended with a stain across the paper, dark and ringed. It could have been spilled tea, or something thicker. And then I reached the final page. Just one line. They want me next. I will give them what they want. No date, no sign-off, no other words. I set the journal down, my hands shaking. I tried to tell myself it was just the delusion of a woman trapped in a decaying house for too long. But the air in the room had shifted while I read. The curtains were still, completely still. And yet, I could swear the fold nearest me was hanging just an inch lower, like it had grown heavier since I sat down. They didn't come all at once. The whispers started like they always did, soft, like the faint rustle of cloth moving in the dark. But this time they grew sharper, more deliberate, until I could make out words. They knew my name. It's hard to explain what that does to you, hearing your name spoken by something you can't see. They didn't sound angry. In fact, they sounded kind, almost loving. They told me I didn't have to fight anymore, that I could stay in the house and be safe. They promised I'd never want for anything again. Gold, food, warmth, even peace. All I had to do was keep the curtains closed to outsiders. It sounded so simple. I could almost feel it as they spoke, this strange, heavy calm wrapping itself around my chest. It was tempting, more tempting than I'd ever want to admit. The house could be mine. I wouldn't have to work another day. No more fear of the world outside. Just stillness. My mind started drifting, imagining it. Days where the sunlight never burned my eyes because I'd never opened the windows. Nights where the only voices were the ones I allowed inside. But then, I saw their faces. Not in front of me, but in my mind. Those pale, empty-eyed children from my dreams. The ones who stood in the hallway staring without blinking. The ones who never spoke. Their mouths hung open just enough for me to see darkness inside. I remembered how they'd looked at me. Not with malice, but with expectation. The whispers were still speaking, telling me I'd be happy here, that no one would bother me, that I'd be protected forever. And for a second, I nearly said yes. But the children's faces stayed, and with them came a sharp, cold understanding. They weren't just warning me, they were showing me what happens to people who take the bargain. I pushed the whispers away, covering my ears like a child. It didn't help much. They were inside my head now, but I forced myself to whisper back, just one word. No. The silence that followed was worse than the voices. The air grew heavier. The curtains didn't move, but I could feel them watching me. They weren't gone. They were waiting, and I knew they would make another offer soon, one I might not be strong enough to refuse. It started small, just the faintest twitch in the fabric when I walked past. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the corner of my eye. But now, it's not pretending anymore. The curtains move on their own. Not just a sway, not a flutter. They ripple, like something's underneath them, pressing against the cloth. And it happens even when the air is still, when the whole house feels sealed tight. Last night, I woke up and noticed the room was colder. My eyes drifted to the window, and my stomach dropped. My bedroom curtain, one I'm sure I closed, was drawn half open. And through that narrow gap, there was no glass. No streetlight, no moon. Just a depth so black, it made me dizzy. It wasn't the kind of darkness you get when the power's out. It was thick, heavy, a void that seemed to swallow everything, even the shape of the frame around it. I should have turned on the light. I should have pulled the curtain shut, but I couldn't move. My eyes stayed locked on that gap because something inside was shifting. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't an object. It breathed. The movement was subtle, but steady, like lungs filling and emptying. Each rise and fall made my skin crawl because I could almost hear it, this faint, damp sound, like air passing through wet cloth. I don't know how long I stood there staring. At some point, the edges of the fabric started to tremble, like whatever was behind them could sense me. It didn't try to come through. It didn't rush at me. It just waited. Finally, I shut my eyes and pulled the curtain closed, my hands shaking so hard I thought I'd rip it off the rod. I didn't open them again until the first light of morning bled through the fabric. Now every time I pass a window I feel it. That pull. It's not just curiosity. It's something deeper tugging at me from inside my chest, whispering without sound, urging me to look again. I think if I let myself see too much, I won't come back. And tonight I can already hear the soft rustle of the curtains from down the hall, as if they know I'm trying not to look. Mrs. Kettering waited until the sun was gone and the sky outside had turned the color of bruises before she spoke. Her hands trembled as she poured the tea, spilling a few drops onto the table. She didn't apologize. She just stared at the steam as if it might carry her words away. "I worked for them once," she said quietly. "The Addingtons." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. She told me she'd been a maid when she was barely 20. The house was grand then, fuller, noisier. The family had money, servants, endless rooms that no one but the Addingtons dared to enter. She remembered one boy in particular, the youngest heir. She said he had pale hair and eyes too old for his age. He was a quiet one, always wandering the halls alone. One evening, she was dusting the upstairs gallery when she saw him. He was standing in front of one of the heavy velvet curtains that hung between two tall windows. She thought he was hiding, playing some childish game. But then, the curtain moved, pulling around him like a closing hand. There was no sound, no cry, no struggle. One moment he was there, the next, the space he'd been standing in was empty. She swore she searched behind it, pulled it aside, nothing but the wall. She told the butler what she'd seen, her voice shaking. That was the last time she ever spoke of it. The next morning, the boy's portrait was gone from the gallery. She remembered staring at the empty space on the wall, feeling like she'd dreamed him up entirely. The staff whispered at first, wondering where he'd gone, but the whispers stopped quickly. Orders came down from the master himself, never speak of the boy again. If anyone asked, he'd been sent away for schooling abroad. Mrs. Kettering's eyes met mine, and I could see the years of fear still sitting in them. She said she left the Addingtons soon after, but she never forgot the way the curtain seemed to breathe as it took him. She leaned closer then, her voice dropping to a rasp. "That house doesn't set loose things, dear. It keeps them. And if the curtains take a liking to you, there sets no getting away." I didn't ask how she knew that. I didn't have to. I didn't care about the warnings anymore. I just needed to get out. My bag was already stuffed with whatever I could grab. Clothes, wallet, my phone charger, even though I wasn't sure my phone would work once I left. The air in the house felt heavier that morning, like it was pressing down on me, slowing me. I made it to the front hall without looking back. The light through the stained glass panels was weak, muted, as if the day outside didn't want to be seen. My hand wrapped around the brass doorknob. It was cold. I twisted. It didn't budge. I tried again, harder this time, my shoulder pushing into the wood. The lock wasn't stuck. It was like the door itself was rooted to the frame. I rattled it until my hands hurt, but it didn't move so much as an inch. That's when I felt it, the faintest movement against my back, like the whisper of a breath. I turned, slow, my heartbeat thudding in my throat. The curtains in the hall were shifting toward me, not swaying like fabric in a breeze. They were reaching. The folds gathered and stretched in my direction, closing the space between us. The air in the hallway was perfectly still, yet the heavy velvet rippled like something was moving underneath it. I stepped back, pressing my shoulders against the door. My bag slipped to the floor. That steps when I heard it. A faint, dry sound, just on the other side of the curtain, fingernails, dragging slowly across fabric. I told myself it was the old wood creaking, but the rhythm was too deliberate. Scratch, pause, scratch. As if someone was waiting for me to answer. I edged toward the side, hoping to make it to the staircase, but the curtains moved again, blocking my way. The smell of dust was thick, choking. My hands trembled so badly I almost dropped my phone. I didn't call out. I didn't dare. My instinct screamed that if I acknowledged it, if I made a sound, whatever was inside that fabric would know exactly where I was. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from deep within the folds came the soft sound of something inhaling. I ran. Not up the stairs. Not toward the hall. Just anywhere that wasn't there. And still, I swear I heard it following. Not with footsteps, but with the whisper of cloth sliding across the floor. I didn't think. I just grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the kitchen drawer and ran straight back to the hall. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The curtains were there, still and heavy, like they'd been waiting for me. I raised the knife and slashed down the middle. It didn't sound like fabric tearing. It sounded wet, like cutting into meat. A high, thin noise escaped from somewhere deep inside it, half hiss, half cry, and it made my stomach twist. I staggered back, clutching the knife tighter. The gash in the velvet wasn't just a cut. It moved. The edges of the opening pulsed faintly, as if breathing. From the darkness inside, something slid forward. It was pale, bone-white, long and thin, almost like an arm, but not quite. The joints bent wrong, and the fingers, if they were fingers, were far too many. Each one ended in a nail that looked brittle, but sharp. They tapped lightly against the wood floor, a patient, steady rhythm. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't sit, even breathe. The thing reached farther, curling toward me, but the edges of the tear began to knit themselves back together. The pale limb twitched, pulling, as if it didn't want to let go. I forced myself to step forward and swing again, but the knife barely grazed it before the opening sealed with a sick, sucking sound. The curtain hung smooth and perfect, no sign of what I'd just seen. No blood, no damage, just the faint smell of something foul like damp soil and rot. My hands were shaking so badly the knife clattered to the floor. The sound seemed too loud in the silence. I wanted to rip the whole thing down, set it on fire, anything, but my feet wouldn't move. Every instinct screamed that if I touched it again, I wouldn't be able to pull away. Then, as I stood there, I felt it, a faint ripple moving through the fabric, right at my eye level, as though something inside was shifting closer. I backed away slowly, step by step, until my heel hit the first stair. The curtain stilled, but I swear just before I turned to run, I saw the faintest bulge push outward, like a face pressing against the cloth from the other side. I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember the cold. It wasn't like waking up. It was like opening my eyes in another place entirely. The curtains were in front of me, rippling as if moved by some slow, steady breath. I stepped through them. There was no fabric on the other side, only open space. Vast, endless, the air so cold it bit into my skin. My breath curled in front of me in pale clouds, but the ground never appeared beneath my feet. It felt like walking through nothing. Shapes began to form in the distance. Figures. At first I thought they were hanging, but as I got closer I saw they weren't hanging from anything at all. They were floating, suspended in midair like puppets without strings. Their mouths were open, every single one of them, frozen mid-scream, but no sound came out. Their eyes were glassy and unblinking, their skin stretched too tight. I knew some of them. The children, the same ones I'd seen darting through the hall, giggling when they thought I couldn't hear. Only here their faces were pale, their small hands reaching for something they could never touch. Behind them more figures emerged. Adults in stiff, old-fashioned clothes, their dresses and suits heavy with dust and age. Some wore expressions of pure terror, others of resignation. All of them were tethered. Thin strands of black fabric snaked from their backs, leading off into the distance, disappearing into the same darkness I'd stepped out of. I realized the strands weren't just attached to them, they were part of them, like veins. One of the children, her hair in long braids, lifted her head toward me. Her lips moved. No sound, just a shape, over and over, like she was trying to force the word through. Help. I wanted to go to her, but as soon as I took a step forward, the cold deepened, biting straight through my chest. My vision blurred, and the black threads around them began to pulse, tightening, almost pulling them farther away. Somewhere behind me, something shifted. The space itself seemed to tilt. The figures started to drift back into the shadows, their mouths still frozen wide. The girl reached out her hand, and for a second I thought I could feel her fingers brushing mine. Then I was standing in my bed, drenched in sweat, my hands still outstretched toward nothing. The curtains in the hall were swaying, and I could swear I heard the faint sound of someone breathing on the other side. I feel it before I even understand it. The house is watching, waiting, speaking without words. The curtains sway, almost alive, and I hear them now clearly. Not whispers, but promises. One final offer, unshakable, unavoidable. Stay, join them, and you will never grow old, never feel sickness or pain, never die. Eternity will be yours, wrapped in the silence and shadows of this house. The warmth of the velvet, the soft pull of the fabric, it calls me. I want to reach for it, to sink into its promise, to escape the world outside with all its mess and fear. But then I think of the children, the ones tethered to the black threads, floating in that frozen space behind the curtains. Their eyes, empty yet pleading, haunt me more than any fear I've ever felt. The adults, the ones who surrendered before, their faces pale and blank. I remember their silent screams, the cold that bit through me like knives. Eternity there is not freedom. It is nothingness, trapped in endless dark. I step back. My heart pounds so hard I can feel it in my ears. The air thickens, damp and heavy, smelling faintly of old linen and decay. I hear soft scraping, like fingernails brushing against fabric, moving closer, testing me. My hands shake. I want to close my eyes, to pretend this choice isn't real, but I can't. The house waits for my answer. I imagine the curtains pulling me in anyway, twisting, wrapping around me, until I'm gone. The thought is unbearable, but so is giving up my soul to the dark. I think of the sun, of fresh air, of life beyond these walls. I think of running, screaming, and living, even if it means fear and pain. The pull grows, insistent, almost tender, but I make my decision. I turn away. My voice, low and trembling, speaks my refusal. The air shivers, the velvet whispers tighten, like a coil snapping around nothing. Shadows stretch and twist, recoiling, almost disappointed. For a moment, everything is still. The curtains hang quietly, the house holding its breath. I can feel its presence, waiting, patient. I am alone, yet not free. The choice is mine, but the weight of it will follow me forever. Outside the hall, the first faint light of dawn creeps through a crack in the window. The darkness recedes slightly, but I know it is only waiting, waiting for nightfall, waiting for the next time the curtains call. The house has changed. It feels alive now, awake in a way that is almost too aware. The curtains lash back and forth, flinging themselves against walls as if angered, though no wind stirs the air. Shadows pool in corners and climb the ceilings, twisting and writhing. I can hear the whispers, hundreds of voices layered over each other, pressing into my mind, filling every hollow space with demands, promises, threats. They scream for me to stay, for me to surrender, for me to become part of the house forever. I feel my chest tighten, a weight pressing down, and I know I can't fight them endlessly. My hands shake as I hold the knife I've sharpened, the steel cold against my skin, my last link to choice, to resistance. The house pulses around me. the floorboards creaking under some unseen weight, the air thick with damp and old fabric, with the scent of forgotten rooms and decayed paper. The velvet of the curtains brushes my ankles, almost tender, almost coaxing. I step back, my eyes darting across the hall. Each portrait seems alive now, the eyes following me, the faces shifting into expressions of expectation, horror, and judgment. I hear the faintest scratching, like fingernails brushing against the back of my skull. My mind races, remembering every warning, every whisper, every glimpse of those children frozen behind the fabric, their pale, empty eyes staring out at me, pleading silently. I breathe deeply, tasting the stale air, feeling it cling to my throat. I have to end this, not by leaving, not by giving in, but by deciding for myself. I move toward the parlor, the room that has watched me, tested me, whispered to me. I force the curtains aside, steel in one hand, my heart beat loud enough to drown out the house's whispers. I am ready for the final choice, the final act. The curtains whip violently, trying to pull me in, to obscure my vision, to swallow me in darkness. But I push forward, feet dragging through the thick, pulsating fabric, every step a defiance, every heartbeat a rebellion. The whispers reach a deafening chorus, voices of children, adults, ancestors, all blending into one unbearable demand. I pause in the center of the room. Silence is impossible, but in this moment I feel the smallest space to act, to choose. I lift the knife, my hand steady, my eyes fixed on the impossible darkness beyond the fabric. I am not afraid, not entirely, not yet. And as the house leans into me, waiting, I make my move. The outcome is uncertain, but the night is mine to confront. The parlor feels impossibly still, like the whole house is holding its breath. The largest curtain hangs before me, heavier than anything I've touched, its fabric thick and pulsating as if it has a heartbeat of its own. My hands shake so badly I can barely grasp the edge. I tell myself to be steady, to see this through, but my chest feels like it's trying to escape my body. I take a deep breath, smelling the faintly sweet tang of old velvet mixed with something darker, something like smoke curling from a long dead fire. I pull, slowly at first. The fabric resists, thick as fog, yet pliable, almost alive in my grip. The whispers surround me, louder now, urging me on, teasing me, warning me. Each inch I uncover reveals darkness so deep it seems to swallow light itself. My skin crawls, my nails dig into the velvet, and my heartbeat echoes in my ears, loud enough to drown out every whisper. Shapes begin to shift within the void. They are indistinct at first, mere shadows stretching and bending as if the darkness breathes. I feel the air move against my face, warm and wet, like the exhale of something enormous, something waiting. A low hum vibrates through the floorboards beneath me, resonating into my bones. I stumble slightly but hold on, refusing to let the curtain pull me back into hesitation. Then the shapes solidify. Ispaladas, faces pale and distorted, eyes wide and hollow, rush toward me from the blackness. Their mouths open in silent screams, limbs stretched unnaturally, yet tethered, floating toward me like water currents dragging me under. My mind reels, trying to comprehend the enormity of what I see. The children from my dreams, the adults in old-fashioned clothing, all swarming, all reaching, all bound to this infinite darkness. In that moment, understanding floods me with a chill colder than ice. This is what the Addingtons became. Not spirits, not shadows, but something beyond life, beyond death, bound to the curtains, part of the house, yet suspended in an endless void that pulses with memory, hunger, and desire. They are neither gone nor alive. They are everywhere and nowhere, and the house itself is a vessel for their eternity. I stumble backward, the curtain snapping lightly against my fingers as if it resents being disturbed. The void seems to pulse in time with my rapid heartbeat, tugging at the edges of my mind. I feel their awareness, impossibly vast, brushing against my thoughts. And just as quickly as it rushes, the shapes recede, the whispers settle into a tense, expectant silence, and I am left trembling in the parlor, staring at the curtain, knowing the house watches me still, and that nothing will ever truly end. I wake with the cold damp of grass pressed against my cheek, the first light of dawn slipping through tangled branches. The air smells of wet earth and moss, heavy with the scent of overgrowth. Blinking, I realize I am lying in the garden, outside the estate. The house looms in the distance, dark and silent, its windows blank, its curtains unmoving. My chest heaves as I try to understand how I ended up here. Relief should wash over me, but it feels hollow, uneasy, like stepping out of a nightmare only to find it trailing just behind. I push myself upright, my hands trembling against the thorny brush. The garden is wild, choked with weeds and twisted vines, yet the paths I vaguely remember seem intact, almost deliberate, guiding me away from the house. I hear the faint chirping of birds, a normal sound that should comfort me, but even it feels distorted, stretched over some unseen tension. My stomach knots as I glance back. The windows reflect nothing, yet I swear the house watches, waiting, patient. I reach into my pocket, and my fingers brush something soft. Pulling it out, I find a thread of velvet, faintly warm as if it remembers the grasp of whatever I encountered inside. My heart lurches, and a cold sweat prickles along my spine. How did this piece follow me? The texture is rich and familiar, and with it comes a memory I cannot shake. The weight of the curtains, the pull, the faces suspended behind the fabric, and the whispers that promised me choices I dared not take. I stand fully, brushing the dirt from my clothes, listening. The wind moves through the garden, stirring branches and leaves, yet not a curtain moves. The house seems asleep, a giant waiting, still and silent, yet alive in a way that defies reason. I feel small here, exposed as if the walls of the estate stretch out toward me, invisible threads tugging at the edges of perception. I take a shaky breath and turn away, walking through the tangled paths toward the distant road, each step heavy with the weight of what I carry. The warmth of the velvet pulses lightly in my hand, almost breathing, reminding me that the estate's hold has not ended. I glance back once more, half expecting motion, half expecting eyes, but the house remains still, watching in silence, patient as ever. The sun rises fully, spilling golden light across the garden, yet I cannot convince myself the danger has passed. The thread of velvet rests in my palm, alive and warm, and I know with a certainty that chills me that the house sleeps again, but it has not forgotten. Even now, long after I left that cursed estate, the Addingtons haunt my nights. Their pale faces, suspended behind endless folds of velvet, visit me in dreams, silent and unyielding. I wake sometimes to find my bedroom drapes moving gently, though every window is tightly shut. My heart hammers, and I tell myself it's only the wind, that shadows play tricks on tired eyes, yet I know better. The air smells faintly of must and old fabric, the same scent that clung to the house and its curtains. A shiver under the covers, every nerve alert, listening for the faintest whisper, the brush of fingers against cloth. Even in my own home, I feel watched, as if the estate itself has grown patient and long-armed, stretching across years and distance to touch me. I remember the warmth of that velvet thread in my pocket, how it pulsed like a heartbeat, and I feel it again in dreams, lightly pressing against my chest. It is a reminder, a tether, a claim. The house does not forgive, and it does not forget. Every creak of floorboards, every sigh of the wind, carries a message I cannot fully hear but somehow understand. It knows where I am, and it waits. Sometimes I walk through my house in the stillness of night, dragging my fingers along the drapes, half expecting them to resist, to ripple with a life of their own. My pulse spikes at every shadow, every flicker of movement, yet I continue, compelled to test the boundary, knowing it is a fragile illusion of control. The memory of the children's eyes, pale and hollow, flashes in my mind, and I bite my lip to keep from calling out, from inviting attention I cannot escape. The dreams grow longer, more vivid. The room behind the curtain stretching farther than I ever remember, filled with those who vanished, tethered to fabric as if it were their life itself. I wake sweating, shaking, and sometimes a faint thread of velvet rests across my nightstand, warm and uninvited. I never placed it there, yet it arrives without warning, proof that the estate's reach is not bound by walls, by doors, or by years. I tell myself never to look back, never to dwell on what I cannot change, but deep down, in the quietest corners of my mind, I know the house is patient, it waits, and it knows exactly where to find me, even now, decades later, even in my dreams.